A gloved researcher leans into the dim light of a cave wall in Portugal, scraping a small red ochre dot into a sample vial. This one is supposed to be nothing. It is the control, the sample chosen precisely because it shows zero visible sign of human contact, the baseline against which every other result will be measured. The lab result comes back, and the control is not clean. It carries human DNA. The location is Escoural Cave in the Alentejo region of Portugal, and the year is 2026. Researchers pulled 120 samples from the cave walls during this sampling process. Only 5 were expected to yield anything usable. This one, the supposed blank, was never meant to be among them, and yet here it is, testing positive. This is not the first time a Portuguese cave has forced scientists to quietly, then publicly, reverse themselves. It is the 4th time in 50 years that a cave in this country has done exactly that. What if the walls themselves had been recording who touched them the entire time? Not as metaphor, as chemistry, as residue, as a record nobody thought to look for until now. There is no summary needed here, no recap to soften it. A control sample that was supposed to prove nothing has instead proven that the surface of a cave wall can hold a trace of a human hand across 16,000 years, and that is enough on its own to sit with for a moment. If prehistoric graffiti walls can hold onto DNA for 16,000 years, the least you can do is hit subscribe before this gets weirder. Because Escoural is only the newest chapter in a much older Portuguese story, one that starts with the country's geography itself and runs through skeletons, shell mounds, and a debate that split the field of paleoanthropology for over a decade. The walls do not lie. They also, it turns out, do not forget. A single dot of ochre, taken as a formality, has just complicated everything scientists thought they understood about who was where, and when, and how long a trace of a person can survive pressed into stone. Portugal is a small country, roughly the size of the American state of Indiana, and yet it holds an outsized concentration of karst cave systems, threading along the Tagus River and cutting through the hills of the Alentejo. 4 separate site complexes, all covered in this video, span a 500,000-year window of human and pre-human history. Almanda holds evidence of Neanderthals. Muge holds Mesolithic shell-middens, built up over generations of coastal foraging. Lagar Velho holds a contested skeleton that would ignite one of the field's longest-running arguments. Escoural holds the 2026 DNA result that opened this story. Iberia functioned as a refugium, a holdout zone at the edge of the continent where earlier populations survived the longest, before either being absorbed into incoming groups or replaced outright. It is the kind of geography where the old world lingers past its expected expiration date. João Zilão, the archaeologist whose name connects 3 of these 4 sites, built his entire career on this idea, that Iberia sat at the edge of the map, a place where the usual timelines did not quite apply. While most textbooks describe clean, tidy replacement events, one population disappearing as another moves in, Portugal's actual record refuses that tidiness. The record here is messier. It overlaps. It contradicts itself. It has produced physical evidence that does not sit comfortably inside the standard narrative of human origins. That messiness starts with a single site, a limestone shelter in a valley that 2 archaeologists entered for an entirely different reason than the one that made it famous. Lagar Velho is where this story properly begins, and it begins not with a plan to find a skeleton, but with a rumor about painted rock art on a valley wall. November 1998, the Lapedo Valley, central Portugal. Archaeologists João Mauricio and Pedro Souto went looking for reported rock paintings, following up on a lead that had nothing to do with human remains. What they found instead was a limestone rock shelter, and inside it, an intact child skeleton. The child was approximately 4 years old at time of death, buried deliberately, with pierced shells placed as ornamentation, and the body packed in red ochre. This was not an accidental burial. Every detail pointed to ritual, to intention, to people who cared enough about this child to prepare a grave. João Zilhão led the team that took charge of the find. The original paper describing the skeleton was authored by Duarte, Mauricio, Petit, Soto, Trinkhaus, van der Plicht, and Zilhão, and it was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 1999. What made the skeleton immediately significant, beyond the ritual burial itself, was its completeness. Most Paleolithic remains that survive to the present day are fragments, a jaw here, a few vertebrae there. This child was unusually intact for something this old, giving researchers a far more complete picture than they typically get from remains of this age. The team almost missed the shelter entirely. They had come to the valley chasing rumors of painted rock art, not expecting to find a burial at all. What the bones showed did not match anything in the textbooks. A prominent chin, a human-shaped skull, modern tooth structure, and inner ear anatomy consistent with Homo sapiens. On paper, this reads as a straightforward Homo sapiens child. Then the lower body tells a different story. Short, stocky lower limbs, the classic Neanderthal proportion. A build associated with retaining heat in cold climates. A pitted occipital bone at the back of the skull, another marker typically associated with Neanderthals, not modern humans. Eric Trinkhaus, the paleoanthropologist on the original team, looked at this combination and argued it pointed to something specific: admixture between the two populations, evidence that Neanderthals and modern humans had interbred, and that this child carried the physical result of that mixing. The team's framing at the time was deliberate and bold. This was not being presented as a modern human child who simply happened to have a few unusual skeletal features. It was being presented as a genuine morphological mosaic, a body built from two distinct evolutionary lineages layered on top of one another. The context makes the claim even more dramatic. Neanderthals were believed, at the time, to have gone extinct roughly 40,000 years before this child was alive. Direct interbreeding between the two populations seemed, on paper, essentially impossible given that gap. Not everyone in the field agreed that the bones were saying what Trinkhaus thought they were saying, and that disagreement did not stay contained to a footnote or a quiet aside at a conference. It became one of the defining disputes in paleoanthropology for the next decade, splitting researchers into camps that argued the same bones meant entirely different things. Ian Tattersall, curator emeritus at the American Museum of Natural History, represented the skeptical wing of that split. Tattersall's broader model of human evolution rested on the idea of many species competing side by side across time, most of them going extinct, with only one line ultimately surviving. It was a framework built around species staying distinct from one another, not blending together at the edges. The skeptical camp's counter-argument was direct. A robust build and stocky legs, they said, can appear in an ordinary modern human child for reasons that have nothing whatsoever to do with Neanderthal ancestry. Bone proportions vary naturally. A stocky child is not automatically a hybrid child. The problem, for both sides, was that no ancient DNA existed yet in 1999 to settle the question either way. The entire debate ran on bone shape alone, on measurements and interpretations of a skeleton that could not speak for itself. This was not a fringe argument confined to obscure corners of academia. It played out in mainstream scientific journals and at major conferences for over a decade, with the Lapedo child becoming one of the most cited, most argued over skeletons in the entire field of human origins research. The technology needed to actually test the hybrid theory, ancient genome sequencing, simply did not exist yet. The debate stayed frozen, unresolved, for more than 10 years. Then genetics finally caught up to the argument. In 2010, the Neanderthal genome was sequenced for the first time. The result reshaped the field immediately. Most people alive today outside sub-Saharan Africa carry roughly 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. That single finding retroactively validated the possibility Trinkhaus's team had proposed over a decade earlier, back when all they had to work with was the shape of a child's bones in a Portuguese valley. The field's dominant assumption up to that point had been clean replacement, one population disappearing as another moved in, with no meaningful interbreeding between them. That assumption collapsed almost overnight once the genetic data existed. It is worth being precise about what this means for the earlier debate. Tattersall's skepticism was not fringe pseudoscience. It reflected exactly where the actual evidence stood before 2010, when bone shape was the only tool available, and admixture was, by the standards of the field, an extraordinary claim without extraordinary proof. This is not a story about science hiding the truth. It is a story about science needing a tool that did not yet exist. There is a detail here that complicates any tidy resolution. No ancient DNA has ever been successfully extracted from the Lapedo child itself. Despite the genome-wide confirmation that interbreeding happened, the hybrid interpretation of this specific skeleton still rests entirely on bone shape, exactly as it did in 1999. The genetic revolution proved the mechanism was possible. It did not prove this particular child. The bones stayed silent. The dating, on the other hand, kept talking. In 2025, a new study published in Science Advances applied hydroxyproline radiocarbon dating, a more precise extraction method than anything available back in 1999, to re-examine the Lapedo remains. The lead author was Bethan Linscott. The result pushed the child's age to somewhere between roughly 27,780 and 28,550 years old, nearly 4,000 years older than the original estimate. That revised timeline places the child about 40,000 years after Neanderthals are believed to have gone extinct. Researchers also redated the objects buried alongside the child, red deer bones and charcoal, and found that some of this material was already old at the time of burial. These were not fresh grave goods gathered for the occasion. They were curated, older material, deliberately kept and placed. Adam van Arsdale of Wellesley, who was not involved in the study, noted that the new date helps clarify how the actual replacement of Neanderthals by modern humans played out on the ground, layer by layer, rather than as a single clean event. The 2025 redate did not settle the hybrid debate. If anything, it deepened it. Neanderthal traits surviving 40,000 years past the species' extinction raises a harder question than admixture itself. How ancestry from a population that is supposedly long gone can persist so far downstream in a single child's skeleton? Which is the exact question the next site in this story runs straight into. Move north from the Lapedo Valley into the Almanda karst system near the town of Torres Novas. The site here is Gruta da Oliveira, under continuous excavation since 1989, led by João Zilhão. The stratigraphy at this site runs from roughly 35,000 to 70,000 years ago, with some contexts pushing past 100,000 years. The entrance sits halfway up a 75-meter cliff face above the Almanda Spring, and the cave itself was only located by exploring the karst system from the inside out, following the underground water network until it opened into this chamber. What makes Gruta da Oliveira unusual is not just its age range, but its continuity. The site preserves an unusually continuous Middle Paleolithic sequence, not an isolated layer representing a single visit or a single generation, but a long, near uninterrupted record of Neanderthal habitation stretching across tens of thousands of years. Current excavation work at the site splits into two areas of focus. Zilhão continues to work on the stone tool assemblage, while Mariana Nabais focuses on the burned bone assemblage recovered from the cave floor. What that bone assemblage showed did not match the old image of Neanderthals at all. Burnt, hearth-focused bone scatters recovered from layers dated between 76,000 and 78,000 years ago tell a specific story. The pattern indicates regular, consistent fire use, not occasional or accidental fire that might result from a lightning strike or a rare event, but structured, repeated cooking behavior returned to again and again over time. Burned rabbit and other leporid remains turn up across multiple Middle Paleolithic layers at the site, evidence that Neanderthals here were hunting small, fast game, not restricting themselves to the big mammals that older models of Neanderthal behavior assumed were their only real target. The old caricature of Neanderthals as crude, big game-only scavengers simply does not match what is actually preserved in this cave floor. The evidence points instead to a flexible, opportunistic diet and a controlled relationship with fire. Site usage patterns at Gruta da Oliveira mirror patterns seen 50,000 years later at Upper Paleolithic and Solutrian sites in this same region of Portugal. The implication is direct. Behavioral continuity across an enormous time gap and across two different human species occupying the same landscape. Neanderthals occupying this cave were doing essentially the same things in the same cave system that anatomically modern humans would go on to do tens of thousands of years later. Same hearths, same rhythms of habitation, different species entirely. The teeth found here tell an even stranger story than the fire pits. 2 Neanderthal teeth recovered from Gruta da Oliveira, alongside a Magdalenian modern human tooth from the nearby Galeria da Cisterna, were all analyzed using laser ablation strontium isotope mapping. Strontium isotopes lock into tooth enamel as it forms during childhood, recording the underlying geology of wherever an individual was living and eating at that age. Effectively, it functions as a childhood location tracker embedded directly into bone, one that survives tens of thousands of years intact. Sequential sampling along the enamel growth axis allows researchers to reconstruct movement over time, rather than capturing only a single snapshot of one location. This produces something closer to a timeline of where an individual traveled during their early years, rather than a static point on a map. The method places 2 Neanderthals and 1 much later Homo sapiens individual, all from the same karst system, side by side, on the same analytical footing, using identical techniques to measure their early movements. This allows researchers to directly compare mobility patterns across 2 different human species, both occupying the identical landscape, separated from one another by tens of thousands of years. Now leave the Neanderthals behind and jump forward to the population that came after them. Travel southeast now, into the Tagus Valley, to the Muge Mesolithic shell-middens. These are mounds built up over centuries, layer upon layer of discarded shellfish, worked tools, and human burials, left behind by people living along this river long before anyone here farmed a single crop. The basal levels of one of these mounds, Moita do Sebastião, were first scientifically dated in 1957 by the researcher Jean Roche. That work sits among the earliest radiocarbon dates ever run anywhere in Portuguese archaeology, making Muge one of the foundational sites for how this entire region's prehistory got its timeline. These are hunter-gatherer sites, not farming settlements. The people who built these middens were pre-agriculture populations, living along the river, fishing and gathering shellfish, for thousands of years before agriculture ever reached this part of Iberia. A long-standing assumption took root in the literature surrounding these sites, that when farmers eventually arrived in the region, this Mesolithic population simply died out, or was pushed out and replaced. For decades, that assumption stood largely unchallenged. It was treated less like a hypothesis and more like settled fact, repeated in paper after paper, without much direct testing. A multi-country research project spent 10 years testing whether that assumption was actually true. A joint research effort ran from 2006 to 2016, drawing on teams based in Madrid, Manchester, Faro, Liverpool, and Durham, all working together on the same question. This was not a quick survey. It was a decade-long cross-institutional undertaking. The project sampled 11 cemetery sites in total. 4 of those were Mesolithic shell-middens, Moita do Sebastião, Cabeça da Arruda, Arapuco, and Amoreiras. 2 were early Neolithic burial caves, Caldeirão and Picoto. 5 more were middle to late Neolithic sites, including a megalithic tomb and burial pits recovered at Castelo Belinho. From those 11 sites, researchers pulled 91 skeletal samples, drawn from 52 individuals, spanning a transect of more than 3,000 years, from the Mesolithic through the late Neolithic. Ancient DNA analysis was combined with strontium mobility analysis, letting the team cross-check genetic ancestry against where each individual had actually grown up and moved during their lifetime. The scale of this sampling effort is unusual. Nearly a century of overlapping cemetery use, mapped person by person, individual by individual, represents an unusually dense dataset for a transition period study anywhere in Europe, not just within Portugal. What that density of sampling turned up broke the old extinction story completely. Neolithic farming populations reached central Portugal by roughly 7,600 years ago, arriving along the Atlantic coast after a journey that began in the Mediterranean. These were genuinely outside groups moving into the region, not local hunter-gatherer descendants who had simply picked up farming on their own. For several centuries afterward, the evidence suggests that Mesolithic Muge hunter-gatherers and these incoming Neolithic farmers occupied the same region simultaneously. This was an overlap, not an instant handoff, not one population vanishing the moment the other stepped off the boat. At the Mesolithic site of Cabeça da Amoreira, researchers recovered Neolithic burials and Neolithic genetic markers directly within the older hunter-gatherer site itself. Farmers and hunter-gatherer descendants were sharing the same burial ground, generation after generation, in the same physical location. Combined DNA and strontium evidence points toward cultural and genetic integration between these two populations, rather than the clean extinction the old model had assumed for so long. The line that had circulated in the literature for years, that the fate of the Mesolithic population was unknown and generally assumed to be extinction, had simply never been directly tested against this level of evidence before this project came along. Muge absorbed its outsiders. The next site did something almost nobody expected stone could do at all. Return now to where this video started, Escoural Cave in the Alentejo, and the 2026 study published in Nature Communications. The full study is titled Investigating Ancient Human DNA Preservation on Cave Walls and in Rock Art. Its lead author is Alba Bossoms Mesa of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and it was published on June 23, 2026. This work forms part of the larger, multinational First Art project, an effort focused on dating and chemically characterizing Paleolithic cave art across the Iberian Peninsula. For this particular study, the team sampled 24 rock art panels spread across 11 caves in Spain and Portugal. The samples included hand stencils, simple painted marks, and pigment fragments, among them material taken from the famous red bison ceiling at Altamira. In total, researchers gathered 120 samples, a mix of cave wall fragments, sediment, bone material, and even a rare ancient tool used for airbrush-style paint application, a device that let Paleolithic artists apply pigment by blowing it onto the wall rather than painting it by hand. Out of 120 samples, only 5 actually worked. The single confirmed pigmented hit from the entire study is a small red dot, catalogued as panel 11, found inside Escoural Cave, the same dot that opened this video. That dot sat under a layer of calcite, a mineral crust that forms naturally over time on cave surfaces, and that crust likely sealed and protected the DNA underneath for thousands of years, acting as a kind of accidental preservation chamber. According to lead researcher Bossoms Mesa, the best preserved samples recovered in this study could be up to 16,000 years old. 2 of the 5 positive samples showed no detectable animal DNA whatsoever, a rare and notably clean signal. Researchers interpret this as strong evidence that the human genetic material arrived through direct human contact, rather than through dirt or debris tracked in from elsewhere. The likely explanation is touch, sweat, or saliva, someone resting a hand against the wall or leaning in close while painting. 3 other positive samples, however, came back mixed with animal DNA, mostly from bats and rodents. That mixture suggests a completely different, indirect route of deposition, separate from the clean hand contact signal found elsewhere. The cave, in other words, appears to have been recording at least 2 different kinds of human contact at once, layered on top of each other across millennia. But the strangest result in the whole study was not even the positive panel. Researchers also sampled unpainted, unpigmented sections of cave wall, choosing them specifically to serve as negative controls. Blank stone selected because it should, by every reasonable expectation, contain nothing at all. 2 of those controls came back positive for ancient human DNA anyway. One was at Escoural, the other was at Corvalón Cave, in Asturias, Spain, hundreds of kilometers away, under entirely different conditions. Dr. Matthias Meyer, of the Max Planck Institute, said this result fundamentally changes how researchers think about where ancient DNA can even be found in the first place. The finding suggests that cave walls broadly, not just painted panels chosen for their artistic significance, may be quietly recording human presence, movement, and behavior far beyond anything anyone previously assumed possible. The study's authors are careful here, and explicit about the limits of what they can claim. They cannot yet prove that the recovered DNA belongs to the actual artists who painted the panels nearby. That caution is worth sitting with. This is not hype dressed up as certainty. It is a genuinely open scientific question, one the researchers themselves flagged directly in their own publication, rather than something glossed over for a cleaner headline, which means the technique's biggest use might not even be about art at all. The method opens an entirely new line of research, the possibility of reconstructing occupation, movement, and behavior inside caves purely from wall DNA, even in cases where no skeletal remains are ever recovered. That matters enormously for sites covered earlier in this video. At Almonda, at Muge, at Lagar Velho, bones are rare, fragmentary, or, in the case of the Lapedo child, genetically silent despite decades of researchers trying to extract something usable from the remains. If wall DNA sampling scales up beyond this initial study, sites with 0 surviving skeletal material could still yield genetic identity data for the first time in the history of their excavation. The technique could, in theory, eventually be pointed at contested sites, including the shelter walls at Lagar Velho itself, though that application has not been attempted yet. The same walls that once seemed like passive rock, inert background to the real archaeology happening on the cave floor, could turn out to be one of the richest untapped genetic archives in the entire field. Step back from any single cave, and a bigger pattern connects all 4 of these sites. Every one of the 4 Portuguese sites covered in this video forced a reversal of an assumption that had previously been treated as settled fact. Lagar Velho reversed the clean replacement extinction model. Almonda reversed the old stereotype of Neanderthals as crude, big game-only scavengers. Muge reversed the assumed farmer-driven extinction of local hunter-gatherers. Escoural reversed assumptions about where ancient DNA can even survive on a cave surface. None of these reversals came from a single dramatic find standing alone. Each one arrived because of a specific technical advance: genome sequencing in 2010, hydroxyproline radiocarbon dating in 2025, strontium isotope mapping applied to individual teeth, wall surface DNA extraction in 2026. João Ziyang connects 3 of these 4 sites directly, tying together Lagar Velho, Almonda, and the broader Iberian replacement timeline debate that runs through decades of research. That connection arguably makes him the through-line figure of Portuguese Paleolithic archaeology across 3 decades of shifting evidence. The pattern across all 4 sites is consistent. Iberia keeps functioning as the place where the clean version of human prehistory breaks down first, where the tidy textbook story meets the actual, messier ground truth. None of this needed a cover-up. The evidence just kept outrunning the tools available to read it. No ancient DNA has ever been recovered from the Lapedo child itself. Even now, in 2026, the hybrid interpretation of that skeleton rests entirely on bone shape, the same kind of evidence available to researchers back in 1999. The Escoural team is equally direct about their own limits. They state plainly that Panel 11's DNA cannot yet be tied directly to the artist who painted the red dot above it. The Muge integration data shows genetic mixing between hunter-gatherers and incoming farmers, but the exact mechanics behind that mixing, whether through intermarriage, gradual social absorption, or some other process entirely, are not fully resolved. Almanda's fire and diet evidence reshapes what Neanderthals were capable of, proving a level of behavioral sophistication the old models denied them, but it does not settle the separate question of why Neanderthals ultimately disappeared from the region altogether. These are not gaps hidden from the public, tucked away or downplayed. They are the actual open questions researchers are working on right now, published plainly in their own papers, stated as clearly as the findings themselves, which is a more interesting place to end than a clean answer would have been. Return to the image from the beginning of this video. A gloved hand, a red dot on limestone, a result nobody was expecting when they sampled it. 4 sites, 1 country, 500,000 years, and in every single case, the walls turned out to know more than the people studying them assumed they could. The Lapedo child is still waiting on a DNA test that might never come back positive, decades after the first debate over its bones began. The Escoural technique is 1 field season old. What it finds next, at Almanda, at Lagar Velho, or somewhere nobody has thought to look yet, remains completely open. So the real question isn't what these caves have already given up, it's what's still sitting on the walls, waiting for someone to swab the wrong spot.